still don't have my voice back, but I'm gonna do these videos this week anyway. And so I'm doing the Hellas award analysis. Now, Hellas, I would say, has probably my least favorite group of awards except for Eccentric. They're not very easy to flip, and most of them are defined easily. But so you'll see a lot of common things here. But yeah, let's just quickly go over what each category is, and then I'll start analyzing each one. So claim is how early you can claim it. I just say early, medium, late, with early usually being mid game. I mean, there's some exceptions where you can claim something very early, but late, medium being Gen 7, 8, late being the last gen. Flippability, how easy it is to flip that award, which is one of the most important things in terraforming Mars. Flipping on awards can be worth 10 points, which nothing else is worth that much, so very important. Deviation, how much you have to sort of make bad plays or moves that aren't aligned with what you should be doing in order to flip or claim the award. And then indicators are sort of what things to see in your opponent early to know who's going to get an award and if you should claim it. The safe range early, that's how much ahead you need to be in that award to claim it early, and then how much ahead you need to be to claim it safely in the last gen, and then finally what corporations are good for the award, what key projects help flip it or win it in the last generation, and what strategies it aligns with. So let's begin. Let's begin with claim. And claim for cultivator, it's really early. Usually you'll know who'll have more greeneries pretty early in the game. It's the player with the most plant production, and the thing is that the big plant production plants that can flip it, insects and NRA, both depend on the number of plant tags, so usually the player who has the least plant production cannot play it as effectively. So I think this is one of the earliest claims. Just you're a bit ahead in plant production and have a couple of greeneries, you know who it's going to be. Magnate. So remember, Magnate is most green cards, and this one's mid. If one player's rushing, one player's going for engine, usually the engine one will have it, but on some games it's closer. Card was really important here, but yeah, I would say mid. Then Space Baron, I think this one's late, and it's tags, but space tags can come in bunches at the end, even though they're expensive. So that's why I would say this one is late. Even though the space tags tend to be expensive, they also have a lot of discounts, and they're generally good placed late in the game. For Eccentric, this one's definitely late. Probably the only really flippable award in the Hellas awards. I would not claim this early. They are crazy plays that can score you a good amount of resources before you can do anything about it. And then Contractor. So Contractor is mid. Unlike Space Baron, building tags are pretty bad late. There's a few like greenhouses and something like Magnetic Field Dome, if it's the case, or Tropical Resort. But other than that, there are very few good steel dumps or late cards. The only thing to watch for is that there is still, but you can claim this mid because steel tags tend to stay where they are after a certain point in the game. Okay, let's go to Flippability. And so, yeah, Cultivator, very low. Yeah, placing greeneries is really expensive. It's not something you can just, do easily. So if you're comfortable here, you're probably not going to lose this award. Magnate, again, low. You can only play one card at the same time, so there's not a lot to flip this. Whoever has more cards and more money is usually going to win this. So yeah, and then again, Space Baron is low. You can only play one space tag at a time. There's no card with two space tags. At least I don't think there is. And they're expensive, so it's really hard to flip late. If people claim early, you can play a bunch of cards, but people don't usually claim this early, so really hard to flip. Eccentric, I went medium, and Okay, so Eccentric is actually very flippable, but the thing is, like, there's usually only one player going for resources, or not every player going for resources. So that's why they didn't go high, even though there are some very flippy cards for Eccentric that you need to be careful. And finally, Contractor, I think it's the lowest. There's really not enough building text to flip this late. It's gonna end up being a pretty expensive play that you can't even plan for with time, so this is one of the lowest in the game. Moving on to Deviation, so Cultivator is very low because placing greeneries late in the game is usually a great thing, right? So it's right up what you want to do. You may have to pay for some with Standard Project, which is less efficient, but overall, greeneries late are a great thing to do, so it's very low. Magnet is low. Now the thing is, I mean, playing green cards is usually what you like. Point cards is usually what you want to do, and a lot of those are green cards. But point cards also tend to be on the more expensive side, so to flip it, you might have to play a couple of cheap cards that maybe aren't doing you a lot. So it's still low. Like you're gonna want to play as many cards as possible, but you're really aiming for as many points as possible, right? So that's why I would say low. Space Baron, again, it's low because a lot of space point cards, like Jovians, for example. Now, they're very expensive, but usually a space tags you have in your hand near the end of the game, as long as they're not events, are things that you want to put in play and are going to help you take this award. Eccentric, very low. Again, most resources, the ones that at least you accumulate in cards, give you points. Of course, there's resources that you can, add and remove, and you usually use those early. But all the cards that dump a huge amount of resources, or even the colonies, that's the other thing. Eccentrics with colonies is very different. I would go highly flippable, but but even the pretty much you want to put resources on cards late in the game because they almost certainly mean points. So very low deviation. And finally, Contractor. I would say Contractor is high just because there aren't many good building tags at the end of the game. You don't want to be playing building tags near the end of the game, definitely. So, yeah, it's high deviation. So let's talk about indicators. So for Cultivator, plant production is the main thing. Greeneries is the second thing. Of course, as you get closer to the end of the game, greeneries becomes more important than plant production, but for the most part, you can track all game. Who has more plant production is going to take this award, and there's really not much you can do about it, even with credit card. For Magnate, the main thing is card draw. Then you want to see, how many cards played, how many cards in hand, and then who has the better economy. But early, who has more card draw is usually going to be able to develop the best economy anyway, and the players are going to have more cards in hand to play. So, yeah, I think card draw is the most important thing. As you get later into the game, you pay attention to cards played and cards in hand, and the economy too. For Space Baron, the main thing is space tags. You also want to look at Titanium Prod and card draw. A lot of good space strategies go with card draw, so yeah, it is, the more cards you draw, the more tags you find, right? Eccentric. So you want to look at who has more resources, and then you also want to look at certain cards that just generate them. That's what I mean by floater microbe capacity. And something like Decomposers, it may have 0 resources, but it's going to generate a ton, and it can do it in very few turns. So you want to look at that, and you also want to look at especially floater cards that place 2 floaters at a time. There's a lot of really bad ones, but there are some good ones like Jovian Lanterns, and those are hard to compete with. You don't care that much about animals. There are a few cards like Large Convoy that plays up to 4 animals, but they're really animals. You don't get that many. Ecological Zone might be the only exception to that, or herbivores, where you can get a lot of animals. But floating microbes tend to be the most numerous resources. Animals tend to be the more valuable. And for Contractor, you want to look at building tax, and you don't really care about steel production, you care about extra steel. Why is that? Because by the end of the game, it's really about how much steel you're floating that lets you play cards that aren't very efficient, but they basically become free. And if they have points on them, then great, right? So yeah, you really want to see who's like not being able to get rid of Aura Steel. That player might play some steel cards late in the game. Again, still very hard to counter. So let's talk about safe range. So for Cultivator, if the difference in plant prod between you and the other second player and greeneries combined is 6, I think you're safe to claim this. So if you're 3 greeneries ahead and you have 3 more plant prod, for example, you're safe to claim this. If you are both at 0 greeneries but you have 6 plant prod and that player's 0, you're safe to claim this pretty early, mid-game. So when I say early again, I mean mid-game. You're never going to claim an award in the first generation. It's not even that good an investment then. And a lot can change. So by the mid-game is when you can start to claim them, and with a combined 6 plus plant prod and greenery advantage, I think you're safe here. For Magnate, I would say 15 cards combined between cards played and cards in hand. Now, assuming the card draw is equal between both players, like you both have a 1 per turn card draw, or no one has Mars University. If the card draw is in the other player's advantage, just wait on this. Don't no rush on claiming this. For Space Baron, I want to say 4 tags, and that's even a little risky for mid game. So this is more of a maybe Gen 7 or 8. But 4 tags is usually fine, even though a lot of tags can be played in the last generation. If the player is not very space aligned by then, probably won't be very space aligned at the end of the game. So yeah, Eccentric. Okay, to claim this early, I would only claim it's almost impossible to claim early. I would need to be 20 resources ahead, and that's because there are some crazy combos. I'll get into them when I get into the projects, and some projects that can give you a lot of resources in a single play. And so yeah, I definitely think this one's very risky to take with anything less than that. And also, if you're with colonies, even more. Like someone can just flip into a strategy, and like I said, resources give you points anyway, so it's not even a bad play to go for this. And finally, Contractor. Early, I would say 6 tags, because the thing about building tags is that if you claim them early, then you do give a chance to flip it, because building tags are cheaper and they tend to go pretty late in the draft. So if you claim this with like 3 tags, I'm gonna keep. I mean, they go pretty late in the draft, late in the game, because they're not that useful. So if you claim this with like 3 or 4 tags, I'm gonna start keeping at the end of the draft a few real lane tags, and then I might consider flipping it, right? If you haven't played many. So yeah, I would go with 6 tags. Safe range on the last generation. So once for Cultivator, once you've taken into account all the plant production that you'll have this generation and after the game ends, and same for your opponent, and even counted some of your opponent's cash as 23 per greenery. If you're 2 greeneries ahead, you're safe. It's very hard that they put 2 greeneries after that calculation. Greenhouses is one of the few ways. 3 greeneries is nearly impossible. So yeah, 2 greeneries after accounting for everything, you're safe. For Magnate, you have to consider cards in hand and also cash. And so you kind of have to do a calculation of how many of the cards in hand can that player play if they have too many. And be very conservative. I usually count 10 per card. And then, even then, I would only claim this if I'm desperate. But if after that you find that you're still 2 cards ahead, you're probably safe. But it's pretty risky when your opponent has a full hand of cards. So yeah, but if you want to do it like that, I would say 2 cards after calculating how many cards they can play late. For Space Baron late, I would say 2 tags. Like I said, space tags are expensive. It's hard to play 3 space tags in the last generation unless they have a lot of titanium. And so, generally with 2 tags you're safe. It's unlikely they'll play 3 and flip it. I mean, you still don't want to play pay all the money for the award, which in the last generation is usually going to be 20, and then get no points. But it's a risk worth taking because it's very hard to flip. So after considering all the tax you have in hand and all the tax your opponent has, I think 2 tax is usually safe. Okay. So first off, okay, eccentricity is the toughest one to explain. If colonies are in play, you have to make sure that your opponent can't screw you out of resources in the colony. So for example, let's say you're collecting microbes and your opponent is collecting microbes and floaters. And so both Enceladus and Titan are active, but when you claim it, you pass to your opponent, and then he trades into Enceladus, and you can't trade into Titan because you're not doing floaters. So you have to make sure that if your opponent trades for resources, then you are able to trade for sure after him to at least tie that up, because a trade with these 2 colonies, Enceladus is better, but it's usually going to be pretty high, and you can even put a colony and then trade, and that's going to give you 5, 6, or 7 resources easily for both. Again, Enceladus is a little better, but yeah, it's not safe if your opponent can trade and you can't, right? So you have to consider that. If you consider that and you can find that neither you can trade because you've already traded, or you can trade, if he trades then you have a chance to trade, and sort of even that out. And after considering everything they're gonna tap, then 5 resources is usually safe. The reason for 5 is that there are a lot of cards, like a shit ton of cards that plays 2 resources, so that's definitely not safe. There's still a lot that play 3, and there's a decent amount that plays 4, but there are very few that go over 4. So with 5 resources, after considering everything, I think you're safe, but know that it can still happen, basically. But then again, this is a risk worth taking because you just don't expect your opponent, you'd rather just risk for 5 points than not take them because your opponent might have one of 3 cards that can flip more than 5 resources, right? So yeah, with 5 I usually claim. And finally, Contractor, I say 3 tax, and again, the reason that even though building tax are way worse than space tax, they're also way cheaper, so I like to be a little more comfortable there in case my opponent has some crazy plays, or just cards they drew that they weren't thinking of using but they kept, and now that you claimed it, they can use it and screw you out. Alright, let's look at corporations. So for Cultivator, obviously the big one here is Ecoline. It's a corporation that places all the greeneries. It's awesome. Then Credit Core. Credit Core is great to combine with plant production and just place slightly cheaper greeneries. And they're also a bit dangerous at the end because yeah, if they get standard projects in that last generation down, then they're placing greeneries for a crazy cheap amount, and if the greens happen to be in power, then they're placing greeneries with a discount of 11, which means greeneries cost 12, which means they can just scrap greeneries in the last generation. Now, of course, that last 2 thing applies to every corporation, but it's more dangerous with Credit Corp because they already have 4 discount, right? Then Philaris, they start with a greenery, which is not a huge advantage, right? Plant production usually matters more, but they're also so uncomfortable to play next to that they almost make you not want to go for ground game. And they can also, when you're both placing greeneries at the end, they can just get all these extra resources, which can be plants which can help them place more greeneries. So Philaris is usually pretty good. I have Lakefront Resorts because they have their Ocean Walk is pretty great, but they do need help from cards to get plant production, so they might not go for a strategy at all. Then Recyclone, one of the corporations that has a good capacity to generate plant production, I think. And finally, Acadian Communities for I think a reason similar than Philaris, except they can actually just obstruct without playing any tiles. Philaris needs the tiles to be disruptive. Acadian doesn't, and they usually want to place the tiles anyway, but I find it a little less effective than Philaris at placing greeneries. I think they're a better city corporation. Okay, moving on to Magnate, and this is just basically all the money cards. I have Terractor first because Well, first of all, they have the most money, but also they get a discount on Earth tax, which are all great and tend to be pretty cheap. Like there's a lot of good early development Earth tax like Nuke Zone, Earth Office, which they play for free, sponsors, acquired company, media group. They're just all the ones I always mention, and so that just increases the number of green cards you can play. Right? There's a few expensive ones, but there's a lot of good cheap Earth tax, just like with building tax. Then pre-start just because they want to do everything that's not terraforming, and that's usually playing a lot of cards, however you play it, and they just get a huge bonus from doing that. And their economy is great. So I have pre-start actually second. Then Vitor. Now Vitor's best thing they can do is play cheap point cards. That means just a lot of cheap, good point cards, and they're great at doing that, and they get a bonus. So yeah. Then Credit Core, of course, they have the great economy. Now their bonus is on standard products and expensive cards, which is not what you wanna play a lot of if you're going for green cards, but the great economy actually enables this a little bit more. So yeah, they're also good. Point Luna, just because it's Point Luna, basically, and they're good at long games, which play lots of cards, and they're the only card corporation with built-in card draw. So if you go back and look at indicators, you'll see that's the main thing, and built-in card draw. The only thing is that their start economy can be a little weak, so they're a bit easier to rush than someone like Director, in my opinion, where you can leave them with a lot of cards in their hand. But overall, the only corp with a built-in card draw is really solid. Then we have Aridor, which I think is just one of the best, easier to grow economies. And they can also bring in a colony, which could be Pluto. And that'll help any strategy that goes for Magnate, basically. Then Mons Insurance, just because that eco advantage, especially on a 1v1, is just huge. And if they do that, that it's a very big step forward in claiming this from you. Morningstar Incorporating, they draw the 3 cards and they play a lot of Venus tags, which can be a lot of cards. And then finally, Chongqing, Mars, and Poseidon. These are just good economies that, well, Chongqing Mars is not a lover of long games. They can go for a ground game and mid-range game, but building tags are really cheap, and Poseidon likes long games because they like colonies and big economies. Saturn Systems, Space Baron. So my favorite here is Saturn Systems. I mean, they start with 1, they have titanium production, and they want to play Jovians, and they deter people from playing Jovians, which are, where a lot of good space tags are. So I think they have a huge advantage in playing a lot of space tags. Then Phobal, all they can do is play space tags, basically. The thing is that they're gonna, you might get Space Baron and then you'll lose. But this is all they do, and they do it poorly, but yeah. Polyphemus usually wants to play expensive cards, which is not great for a higher number of tags, but with tags it's not as important as with Magnate. So, and a lot of expensive cards are space tags, and they start with the extra titanium and the great economy, so this is obviously good for that. Then Point Luna, they start with titanium production, and they like long games. Morningstar, just because a lot of Venus tags have space tags and you draw them extra and you can play them easier. Asteroid actually has great titanium production if you play it that way, and the 6 Asteroid combo cards, a lot of them have space tags. But I just see them play a lot less, so and their starting cash is really low, so they're building the engine can be a little hard, but yeah. Then finally, Credit Core, again, they like expensive cards. Expensive cards tend to be space tags, so they can play a lot of space tags. Vitor, same thing, a lot of point cards are space tags, and they get a rebate. And Director, just because of the great economy that they can build from round 1. For Eccentric, so actually I think Celestic is the best one. They're basically guaranteed 10 resources. You can always place them on the floaters on things like aerial mappers, which you'll be removing. But probably the last 4 or 5, you're gonna play some point cards. And then you're also drawing cards that have something to do with floaters. So Celestic is always going to have a lot of floaters, and it's probably going to be the first one. Then Arclight, you're probably going to get 10 to 12, or even maybe 14 resources on Arclight. It doesn't draw the cards, which is why I think Celestic is better. Like having two things producing resources is almost always going to beat out one thing producing resources. But yeah, Arclight just they have basically a head start of 12. Then Morningstar incorporating just because they draw Venus card, and those can be floater cards. So similar reason to Celestic, but Celestic is more targeted. Then Stormcraft is garbage, but they do place a resource per turn just like Celestic. They just don't draw the cards, and they have a worse way to use the resource, in my opinion, which is 25% of a terraforming rating, the worst terraforming rating heat. So, but they do have a way to do it, and they can use Jovian cards that are better than their own ability to do so. Then Priester will usually get 6. I find that 6 is really easy to get of the conservation resources just by itself. And then they also like long games. They can play floaters, they can play animals. Microbes I think a little less, but still it's still pretty decent. Then Byron just needs the point card, but if you get something like Jovian Lanterns, which is 1 point but using 2 floaters, so it's like an animal. It's the same point efficiency than an animal, but it's better for eccentric because it's double the resources. Then Byron is gonna be in game. There just aren't that many, and the other reason it's low is because you usually, when you go for points, animals are the easier ones to find, that are like 1 point per turn. So birds, fish, penguins, and livestock, those are usually the ones that Byron's going to be hitting twice. For floaters, like something like floating hubs is obviously not as good, so you really need Jovian Lanterns to do that 2 times. I feel like you can get extra 3 or 4 resources with Byron, unless you use Jovian Lanterns, basically. Then Splice can gain microbes. It's not great, but it's still an advantage. And Ecoline, just because Ecoline I think is one of the best corps to play with Ecological Zone, and they play so many plant tags and get that greenery out so early. But it will really depend on the combo. You need Decomposers and Ecological Zone. Ecoline is just one of the few corporations where it's almost easy to play Ecological Zone on the first or second turn before you play your next plant tag, right? So really good. And finally, Contractor. So I mean anything that's a building tag, it's almost guaranteed to go to Mining Guild. They also have the starting 5 steel and the steel production and the capacity to get an insane amount of steel production. They just want to play building tags all game, and they're still the best at that. Second is Shang-Qing. They start with money production, but they still get a 2 discount on every building tag, so they're super cheap, and they also start with 1. Factorum can draw building tags, so that's very powerful for this award, and it's one of the ones you have to watch for at the end of the game if you make sure they don't flip it, because they can just almost guarantee that they can grab a card and play it for the last 3 generations, right? So, yeah, be careful. Then Tharsis, because Tharsis wants to play cities. They want to deter you from playing cities, and to play cities they need energy, which are often building tags, and they want to get steel production. So, they get steel production. They can play. They are good at playing a lot of cards with steel that have steel tags. Building tags, and they also deter opponents from playing cities, which are usually one of the most played building tags. So yeah, they're really good. Then Philaris, they're in the ground. They're not. And they can gain steel as one of the resources, but it's not really that strong. Manutech starts with the steel production, but I find that you really want to exploit is the Gash Titanium implants with Manutech, so that's why I don't have it so high. You can do it with steel, but it honestly is not the best way to play it. Then Acadian Communities. Again, I think it's more of a city corp. I'd really like it to play a lot of cities and block, and then use tiles, which are often building tags, to use your block spaces. But again, not as strong. Recyclone, I think it's really good actually. They just don't have any advantage on how to get the building tax, but they are one of the corporations that get the most out of the building tax, and they're also fun. Um, Finally, interplanetary cinematics. You might find it weird that I have it so low because of that starting cash, but usually what I want to do with them is play events. Like I'll use my 20 steel as fast as possible. Like Builder is really good, but after I run out of steel, if I didn't generate steel production, which I mean, 20 steel is a lot. You don't need that much steel production with them. You are better off playing things like Olympus Conference and Mars University and then MedLab or something like that, you know? After that, I really just want to go into space and play events and do more titanium. And if I get things like mining area or mining rights with IC, I will almost assuredly place them on titanium because 20 steel is a lot. You don't need more than one or two production, and you don't want to play that many steel cards after you use your initial cash. And then finally, Utopia Invest. Now they have the thing where they can. I mean, they start with steel production, and they can also pop off steel at the end of the game to maybe, surprise you with an extra steel tag. But it's really not a huge advantage. Now let's talk about key projects for each one. So there's only one for cultivator, and that's greenhouses. So it's the same thing as I went with this on Landlord. It's the only card that can potentially, I think, generate more than two greeneries by generating, maybe 9 or 10 plant stops, and then, you get a full one, and maybe you were too short of the second one, and you just get that. Magnate. So I think the risk with Magnate are things that draw 3 or more cards. Especially if they're also green cards. And there aren't that many. The first one is Sponsor Academies, which will make you discard one, but that doesn't matter. I usually have a card that you won't use anyway in the last generation. And it also makes your opponent draw, but you can usually do this after game end, I would say. Play the Sponsor Academies to surprise flip the award. And so that's kind of why I have the safe range at 2 cards, because if you play draw 3 cards by playing a green card, then you're also the likelihood of you drawing at least another green card is good. 2 green cards is decent. 3 green cards is almost impossible. So yeah, things that are a green card that draw 3 cards are actually really good to flip these. This second one is ISO for research, and the reason is lower is 1 is more expensive, and 2 there's a huge condition on it that you have to have Venus tags, which is not easy, right? It's better because it's a Jovian tag and it can give you points and it can interact. Also, these 2 cards can both interact with Marcio and Olympus, so they can get you even 1 or 2 extra cards. And I think these are the better things to flip. Magnate. Finally, Solar Probe. Really unlikely that it gets you 3 cards, but in some rare cases it can. I don't think I've ever seen it get 4. You need 12 science tags and this card. So, but yeah, these are the only cards that can draw you 3 cards and sort of like mess up your calculation at the end of the game. For Space Baron, there's just nothing that plays 2 space tags. Your opponent's going to be playing them 1 at a time. It's just not going to happen that a single card's going to flip this. Eccentric. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. So the first one of the promo cards, Back to Viral Research. These can get you easily, 7, 8, maybe even 10 microbes. Because it's 1 per science tag, and what's more ugly, it can do it for a player who wasn't even going for that. You might not even be going for that. You get some shitty card where you can place microbes, and then you play Viral Research, and you were going for a maybe science base, and suddenly you can flip this award, right? It's pretty crazy, and I don't think almost anything like science tags are one of the most numerous tags. It's very few things that can give you more resources in one go than this. Only the colonies, right? Then Satan Surfing, which I recently included in the cards I think are weaker. I might have been wrong on this one because I hadn't thought this is really good for flipping Eccentric. It's totally worth it if you do that. And again, 7 or 8 9 Earth tags. It's not hard to have at the end of the game. The limit of 5 is only in the cash you get, not on the number of resources you place. So yeah, really good. Hydrogen to Venus. Now, Jovian tags are a lot more rare than Saturn Surfing and back to viral research. Usually, you have 6 or 7, you're probably winning the game with some multipliers anyway. But nevertheless, it can get you. It gets you more than 4 resources, almost for sure. So yeah, that's another one that's really good. Then imported nitrogen, this gets you 5 as long as you have a target with the microbes. It's usually worth playing without the target, but it gets you 5. So these are the only 4 cards that I found that I think place more than 4 resources. And they are the ones that you have to watch out for, which imported nitrogen only placing 5. So if you're 5 resources ahead and they place on you, they only tie, right? However, they can play 2 cards that play 4 resources, right? And so I still, or one that plays 4 and then one that plays 2. So I still think it's important to mention the one that plays 4. Large convoy, now it's very expensive, so it's really hard to follow up with someone on something else. But it's one of the most commonly used cards in the last generation. It's almost like every game someone's gonna play this, essentially, unless it's buried at the bottom of the deck. But because it just gains 7 points, you're just likely to see it, so that's why it's so high, and it's one of the best cards to play in the last generation too. And Jovian Lanterns, it plays as 4, but also if you go a generation earlier, it goes for 6, right? And it gets you a ton of points, so it makes a lot of sense to play it. So yeah. Then Important Nutrients places 4, but it also gives you 4 cards, and you can also get a lot of discounts on it. So, it's microbes, so it's weaker, but it is cheaper, and it gives you 4 plants. If it gives you an extra greenery, it's usually worth to play. And now we get into the really not great ones. Nitrate reducing bacteria. Again, you can play these, get 3, and then place 1 more, you get 4. So if you're flipping the award, it's worth it, but it's actually not giving you any extra points. And the same thing with extractor balloons. So all the other ones are usually getting you something on top of all the resources. These 2 you would only play late to flip the award, and you have to be sure, otherwise you make a huge investment into nothing. So some pretty important cards are missing on this list, and that's because I just wanted to mention them together: viral enhancers, decomposers, ecozone, and advanced ecosystems. This is, to me, the original combo to steal eccentric. You obviously don't need all of them, but the more you have, the better. And together, I think this is 13 resources and 8 points. If you play this in the rest, so you play viral, then decomposers, then ecological zone, and finally advanced ecosystems, you get 13 resources, 8 points, and 3 plants. So it's pretty amazing, honestly. It's not likely that they'll have all those cards, but and especially not at the end. You usually want to play decomposers and ecological zone as soon as you can, and viral enhancers too. Advance, you'll get that near the end, but just seeing these on the table is enough to not claim eccentric from me. The first 3, viral enhancers, decomposers, and ecological zone, if they're on the table, I'm probably not claiming eccentric. Just because there's so many combos that can, with them on the table, a lot of cards give you 4 resources. And finally, contractor, again, none, because there's nothing that gains 2 tags except mining guild. So yeah, there's no real card to worry about there. Finally, let's go into alignment. So cultivator, it aligns both with ground rush and ground cities. Magnate, engine, science, and MC are the better ones. For space baron, engines with MC and titanium are also science or a pure Jovian strategy. For eccentric, I think microbes is usually where you can get more resources. Floaters second, and animals third, because animals tends to be more efficient resources. Now these aren't a strategy on their own. They're usually combined with plants for microbes and animals, or with floaters. They can be all over the place, but that's the thing. That's what they align to. And finally, contractor. That goes well with a mineral engine game or a ground cities or hidden energy, because hidden energy actually depend a lot on building tags. But yeah, that's it. That's all for my video. I hope you liked it. Let me know what you think, and see you next time.